Welcome to Junkyard Writing. I am your host, Erin Maria, with a BFA in creative writing and two cats who love to reenact scenes from The Lion King at 3 in the morning. We're here today with the insanely popular Junkyard trope, The Chosen One. Every writing advice blog out there tends to put this trope as one to always avoid, including the New York book editors. It sits at spot number 2, just behind the love triangle. The Chosen One as a concept is as ancient as literary devices come, depending on if you view Gilgamesh in the Epic of Gilgamesh as a chosen one or not. Stories from ancient Greece are a plenty vault of chosen ones with Psyche, Oedipus, Theseus, Odysseus, all the yesses. Dystopias often feature chosen ones too, such as Jonas from The Giver, Katniss from The Hunger Games, and Triss from Divergent. The Epic of Gilgamesh, also referred to as Surpassing All Other Kings or He Who Saw the Deep, is not the oldest story, just the oldest story we have evidence of being written down. So it's a safe leap in logic to assume that the idea of being a chosen one is far more ancient than we know, since there are books in 2022 coming out with utilizing a chosen one. We must agree, at the very least, that humanity is, and always has been, interested in the concept of destiny, and more so, interested in the idea of a single set of hands drastically changing the world. It suggests, perhaps, the Chosen One is an attempt to conquer powerlessness and a way to articulate why people act the way they do when such actions seem so completely bizarre from an outsider looking in. Is it easier to understand why people commit incest when Oedipus is fated to kill his father and marry his mother? Do you think that perhaps when the sons and daughters of the ruling class were met with the taboo of incest to secure power for the throne, that stories like Oedipus might have been told as a cautionary tale of what happens if you attempt to run from it? It might be comforting for the sons and daughters to know that this incestual taboo that they're going to commit, like Oedipus, is commanded by fate, and they are innocent of the sin that is attached to said taboo. In Exodus from the Bible, God hardens the heart of the Pharaoh to refuse Moses and Aaron so the plagues may be cast upon Egypt as punishment. The Pharaoh has become a villainous chosen one, and do you think that perhaps it was more comforting for the slaves to think that God caused the Pharaoh's cold heart, because what else could possibly cause a mortal man to act so inhumane? Something fantastic that the Prince of Egypt does in its retelling of this story is it takes out God's decision to harden the heart of Ramses. Instead, he warns Moses that Ramses will not listen. It allows us to witness the 10 plagues from the perspective of an Israelite who never interacted with Moses and therefore could not know that God hardened the heart himself. This change forces us to confront with the fact that humans can be evil, and if they can do this, then what other dark roads can they go down? And that is inherently a terrifying question to ask, and one that is answered anyways. There's also something special at the idea of being picked, that someone saw you and thought this is the person for which greatness resides in, and that greatness will serve humanity in some meaningful way. People generally like being noticed for their talents, and that's not something we should fight against. We can see evidence of this deep desire in baby boomers. The participation trophy has been a term boomers often use to ridicule Generation Y, millennials, and Generation Z, the Zoomers. But in reality, participation trophies pretty much stop at 5th grade, maybe stretching to high school. I'm sure there's high schools and colleges that use them as well, but for the most part, it's for children. And the children of Generation Y did not kick their feet and demand participation trophies. We didn't even know what they were. This was, therefore, a gift from the boomers. The question is why? And why did the boomers come to detest them? The boomers are known as the me generation, and there have been studies that found narcissism to be a characteristic of this generation, and a form of narcissism called vulnerable narcissism, according to WebMD, is a form of narcissism that is a trauma response. The traits that we associate with narcissists become a way in which someone survives. And there's an anxiety that develops when they aren't treated as special or unique. It kind of sounds like boomers. And if it's this form of narcissism that has affected the generation, it would make perfect sense that the participation trophy became popular for their children. This might have been a failed attempt for boomers to not be their parents, to be better parents. Additionally, a common phrase you hear from boomers is, "My father beat me and I turned out fine." And to that I ask, but did you want to get beat? If you were harmed upon failure, then failure is not an option. Trying is not good enough. You already have to be where you're expected, and if you're not, then you're wrong. And in certain cases, it warranted physical harm. The boomers have had perfectionism beat into them literally, and there's something tragically profound at them using lots of participation trophies so that their children knew that their efforts, even if not good enough to win, were good enough all along. And sometimes I wonder if participation trophies in those early years were somewhat successful in encouraging children that an experience is just as valuable as a victory, and an attempt is better than to have not tried at all. And the success might have scared the boomers, because if their parenting method was working without having to hurt their children, then why were boomers beat by their parents? And because they're characterized by narcissism, their upbringing being correct and their children's upbringing being correct cannot coexist. So millennials are branded as entitled, who are so fragile that they need participation trophies, and none of the blame falls onto the people who gave them those trophies. Here is my open letter to baby boomers. It's alright to admit that you wished you were in an environment that allowed for failure, that allowed for mistakes, that you wished someone recognized that you had some potential, that you could be something. I am not a psychologist. These are just philosophical musings about boomers and recognition. Someone once told me narcissist accusations are confessions, and if that's true, what does it say about boomers when they accuse millennials of just wanting someone to give them participation trophies so they felt special? It's all just incredibly sad, and even sadder that boomers really were heroes that lived long enough to see themselves often become villains. What do participation trophies have to do with the chosen one? Well, it's possible because of the negative connotation that participation trophies have because of boomers and millennials. Perhaps this is contributing to the general hatred towards the chosen one trope. Again, the chosen one shows up on almost everyone's do not use list. I'm not saying that this is why, because I'm just pondering, but it might be a contribution. Additionally, we know that in real life, events are seldom shaped by the hands of a single person. We tend to associate major events to a singular person, but that's just an illusion. Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, and Dylan Mulvaney, and many others are just some of our strongest voices. And while the work they do is tremendous for a better world, it would be a generous mistake to say that they alone are the hands of change for their particular activisms, and I doubt that any of them would claim to be that either. This can be existentially painful to come to terms with, that despite your tenacity and drive, the probability of you getting just the chance to be recognized as a major player in an event is incredibly small. This space that the aforementioned activists occupy is the closest an everyday person can truly get to a secular chosen one. Religion has a different relationship with a chosen one concept, and because the concept of religion itself is so incredibly complex, I'm choosing to acknowledge this fact but not go into detail. I'm interested in what an average person can be, and that requires the discussion to be secular in nature. So perhaps the chosen one is also a form of escapism. In the throes of fiction, we can pretend that a single person has the capacity to change the world in a grand and meaningful way, that it's more common than it actually is, that maybe, if we really try hard enough, we too could be the face of a movement. We could be remembered for doing something significant. This is all speculation and pondering, of course, food for thought. Our fascination about destiny and the greatness of the individual won't have definite answers, and not everything I said you will necessarily agree with, which is all right. What we do know is that the chosen one is an extremely ancient concept, and humans have been deconstructing and reconstructing it since the beginning, and despite the writing norm's best efforts, we will continue to do so for generations to come. Enough thinking. It's time to get our hands dirty and figure out what it takes to get the chosen one to work. The chosen one tends to fail when we can't properly explain why someone is chosen, or the explanation just isn't good enough. And what's most fascinating about this is it's not actually difficult to get away with this trope. Humans tend to notice when things are going wrong more than when things are going right. Imagine a pianist playing at a concert, a lovely familiar tune, for Elise. All the notes are flowing together as the song takes you on a journey. Then the pianist's hand slips, and several discordant keys jerk you out of the moment. Thing is, you probably don't know what the real right note is off the top of your head, but you definitely know that whatever happened was incorrect. And it doesn't matter how many more times that you hear different pianists play for Elise, you're probably going to remember the one time it was played badly because it was different and stuck out in the way that hundreds of other perfect performances didn't. The same principle applies to our ability to notice tropes. They tend to be invisible when they're working well and glaringly obvious when they're not. All protagonists are chosen ones because the storyteller has to pick them to be the protagonist. Moses from the Prince of Egypt has been chosen, which is easy to see because of the divine religious aspect. But Shrek is chosen in his own right, too. The question we must ask ourselves as we sit down to write our story is, why were you chosen, and why not someone else? And we're going to refer to this question as the tropic question. The weight of what it means to be chosen fluctuates depending on what the story demands of the protagonist. Stories that put little emphasis on the act of being selected don't really need complicated answers to the tropic question. Why Ginny B. Jones is the protagonist of her story carries a lot less weight than why Katniss is the protagonist of hers. Emphasis on being selected determines if a story is associated with the chosen one trope. But regardless if we call the protagonist chosen or not, every storyteller needs to answer the tropic question. Why is this character the protagonist, and why not somebody else? We're going to circle back to this, because first we need to look at stories that emphasize the chosen one status, and therefore are considered to have the chosen one trope. Jonas from The Giver is selected at the age of 12 to become the receiver of memories. He's chosen because he is the correct age, displays the necessary traits, intelligence, integrity, courage, wisdom, and the capacity to see beyond. The capacity to see beyond is something you are born with, the light or blue-colored eyes. So, why Jonas? Why not anyone else? We found is a clear set of rules that eliminates every other possible character from being the receiver of memories. Something more interesting is that we see the selection criteria for receiver change when it fails. Rosemary's case caused 2 changes in the rules that Jonas must follow. 1. Jonas needs all the personality characteristics so that he can endure pain and suffering where Rosemary couldn't. And 2. Jonas cannot apply for release because receiver of memories are like Pandora boxes. Once they are released, then their memories return to the community, and that disrupts the natural order. So not only is there a selection process, but the fact that it is imperfect in the novel gives it a bit of humanity. It makes being selected seem more grounded, more real, and less cosmic and arbitrary. I'm gonna call this feature narrative Anima, where narrative devices are grounded in the world's reality rather than seeming random or cosmically arbitrary. Jonas is not the only person who can be the receiver of memories. The Giver, Rosemary, and Gabriel all have this ability too, which also makes the chosen one trope more tolerable. Jonas is special, but not so special that it must be him and him alone. Jonas ultimately concludes if he is released, in the sense of escape rather than death, then his Pandora box will open and the community will be better off. The giver does not take up this responsibility because he is old and perhaps a little guilty for his complacency and wants to help everyone in the community heal after Jonas leaves, so it cannot be the giver to break Pandora's box. Gabriel, the baby, is scheduled for release because he's not maturing properly. All of Jonas's plans go sideways as he decides to kidnap Gabriel and flee to the fabled elsewhere. The entire build-up to this moment is the novel providing us a solid case for why it must be Jonas to do this and not anyone else. Interestingly enough, we see that Jonas has become Chosen One twice, once to fit his Chosen One role as receiver of memory, and a second time to rebel and escape with Gabriel. And we're gonna see this pattern repeat. The success of Jonas and his Chosen One status is the following. 1. Answering the tropic question, why Jonas and why not anyone else? 2. A clear set of qualifications that only change if it fits the story's narrative constants. 3. Elimination of all other possible candidates for every round of selection the protagonist undergoes, either literal or thematic. And 4, if possible, give the selection process narrative anima, so that it feels grounded in reality instead of cosmically arbitrary. We're going back to look at that second item on the list because, oh my god, she's made up another term. What are narrative constants? Narrative constants refers to concepts that are established in a story that cannot change because it would cause the themes and even the plot to fall apart. The Hunger Games selection process of Katniss Everdeen is a fantastic example of where we see the selection process change because the story's narrative constants demand it to, and it's not Katniss volunteering. Like Jonas, Katniss is actually selected twice, first to enter the Hunger Games and second to lead a rebellion. But first, let's just talk about the qualifications of being selected for the Hunger Games itself before we get into how the selection changes in the second book. The Reaping is a random selection of one girl and one boy from every district. With each participant between the ages of 12 and 18, you can agree to put your name in for more food. The only times these rules change is during the Quarter Quell, which were pre-written after the first rebellion. Additionally, you can volunteer to be a tribute. Now, think of narrative constants like unwritten rules for your themes and plot, the things that have to be followed in order for those two things to make sense. So the two narrative constants in the Hunger Games that we're going to be discussing are 1. The Capitol isn't playing fair and never was, and 2. The Hunger Games is a punishment for rebellion and a tool used by the Capitol to prevent a second one. These two things have to remain true for the story to make sense thematically and plot-wise. In Catching Fire, it's heavily implied that these so-called pre-written instructions are either a myth entirely or the 75th was changed to specifically target Katniss. The rules of selection have changed, but we accept these changes because it's more important that the Capitol isn't playing fair and never was, and the Hunger Games is a punishment for rebellion and a tool used by the Capitol to prevent a second one to remain true. So, why Katniss in Catching Fire? Why not Peeta? Something particularly interesting in Katniss's selection to lead the rebellion is that Snow picked Katniss. Katniss has only ever cared about her little sister Prim and wanted to wash her hands of the Capitol after the games. She didn't want to lead a rebellion, she wanted to be left alone. The Capitol deciding that Katniss is a rebellious threat and the decision to punish her for it is exactly why Katniss becomes the face of the rebellion. The Capitol has convinced itself that Katniss is the problem, and if she dies, so does the rebellion. And had they left her alone, it might have been possible the unrest would have faded away the same way we see problematic behavior fade away over time when it's committed by celebrities. It is Katniss they target because Katniss formed a relationship with Rue and showcased an intense level of empathy that the districts have been devoid of, especially in something as brutal as the Hunger Games. And it is Katniss they target because it's Katniss who suggests eating the berries, not Peeta. That's what seals her fate. Let's change the story. Let's say that Rue dies in the initial bloodbath, and at the end, Katniss has blueberries in one pocket and Nightshade in another. She gives Peeta the nightshade, and they eat the berries. Peeta dies. And in the victory interviews, Katniss mentions that telling Peeta it was a way to rebel against the Capitol was the only way to get him to eat the berries without question. He should have known better. They were in the Hunger Games after all. Katniss did what the Capitol would do: punish the rebel. Now let's pretend that Katniss still has to compete in the Quarter Quell for the same exact reason written in Catching Fire. It doesn't make sense to punish Katniss because if anything, she was thematically destroying the concept of rebellion by killing Peeta. The Capitol should love her. Snow should love her. It then becomes arbitrary and forced that Katniss must compete again because that second narrative constant is not followed. Punishing her doesn't make sense because in this rewrite, the unrest can't happen because she never saved Rue, and she punished Peeta for trying to rebel. We would need to do a lot more work for people to buy into Katniss going in a second time, whereas before, in the way that it's originally written, it makes sense. Katniss accidentally started societal unrest and she couldn't contain it. As punishment, the Capitol is going to try and kill her. Everything that you have established to be true should remain true regardless of what happens to the story. Any changes to the narrative constant should be catastrophically significant. The Capitol losing its power and therefore unable to not play fair is only after 3 novels and 75 in-universe years. It is catastrophically significant because the world is no longer the same in Panem. Let's quickly revisit the 4 observations that we noticed with Jonas in The Giver and Katniss in The Hunger Games. Answering the tropic question, the clear set of qualifications that only change to fit a story's narrative constants, the elimination of all other possible candidates for every round of selection of the protagonist, either literal or thematic, and if possible, give the selection process narrative anima. Veronica Roth's Divergent, we don't get a clear sense of what it really means to be selected as Divergent. With the exact way that the books are written, we can draw one of 3 conclusions. 1. Veronica vaguely knew what all the rules were to being Divergent before Book 1 was written, but didn't set anything in stone until it needed to be. 2. Veronica didn't have anything set in stone for what it meant to be Divergent until it needed to be. Or 3. Veronica knew everything about what it meant to be Divergent before Book 1 and simply did not execute it well. I tend to believe option 1, that Veronica sort of knew what the rules were, but just didn't plan it all the way out. Even if you don't plan on revealing everything to the audience, you should know all the narrative constants your world is operating under, because the world follows the constants whether the reader knows about them or not. The writers of Encanto didn't provide an answer as to why Mirabel didn't get her powers, and through their own admission, they told us that they never even thought about it. They took the easy way out and said it's up for interpretation, and unfortunately, you can tell in the movie that they didn't answer the question. We don't know why Mirabel didn't get a gift, but the world state should know, because the world state didn't give her a gift. In Birdbox, we don't get any real answers about what the monsters are, besides the fact it's something like infinity. But it's clear that the monsters are operating by a set of rules, and though we don't know them, based on the things that they do, we can clearly see that there are rules that they are and are not following. That's why one of the biggest theories in Encanto is that it has to do with Mirabel wiping her hands on her dress. Another one is maybe Casita chose her to be the next matriarch because Abuela doesn't have a miracle either. We're assuming that there are hidden rules the magic is following in its selection process. And you would think, with the central problem being that Mirabel was chosen not to be miraculous, that we would get some closure as to why. Why aren't there any in-world theories about why she wasn't selected, in the same way that Birdbox is constantly throwing out theories in-world of what the heck those monsters are? Your narrative constants can be hidden, but the world should be operating like it knows all the rules anyways, because it does. All of this is to say that as long as the storyteller is operating by the rules of the selection process, the reader doesn't necessarily need to have it spelled out for them. That's the case with Divergence in its trilogy. We don't get all of the answers right away of what it means to be divergent and what that selection process is. and it's clear that there are some rules we don't know about, but are being adhered to nevertheless. So in Divergent and Insurgent, we know two things about Divergence. One, Divergent means you have traits of more than one faction. Two, Divergent means you can resist various serums. By the time we get to the final novel, Allegiant, the real selection process is revealed. Divergent means you are genetically pure, and this purity is what allows you to exist in more than one faction and resist various serums. So why does Triss still sort of fail as a chosen one? And why is it Tobias and Caleb's fault? The failure of Triss Pryor. Caleb. The basics of genetics is that you get half from your mom and half from your dad. If Triss's mom is 100% divergent and Triss's father is 1.567% divergent, his ancestors 7 generations back was 100% divergent, we're assuming. That means both Triss and Caleb must be at least 51.567% divergent. It's perfectly reasonable to assume that being over 50% is what is considered completely genetically pure. If not, then Triss isn't divergent or genetically pure, and that's a narrative constant, that she is divergent. Triss cannot not be divergent. The whole story falls apart if she isn't divergent. The story fails to answer the question, why Triss and why not Caleb? The simple answer is he lost the genetic lottery, and that simple answer isn't acknowledged, and it causes an even greater question that the novel also doesn't answer. If you can lose the genetic lottery and not be divergent where your sibling can, then why? Why isn't Caleb even like Tobias, who is a pseudo-divergent? What are the necessary genes to be considered pure, and why is it a toss-up between if you get the right genes from the right parent? I'm here on the internet searching for answers and have come to an understanding that sperms and eggs fused together have different combinations of parental genes, which is why siblings don't all look the exact same unless you're an identical twin. In order to get away with the chosen one, we know that the tropic question has to be answered. Why Triss and why nobody else? There's nothing about how Triss's combo of genetics and Caleb's combo of genetics are different because they're not twins. So the book doesn't give us any real reason why not Caleb beyond because Veronica said so. And I thought maybe I missed it, but there's no clear answer on the internet that tells us why Caleb isn't divergent beyond him not pinging more than one trait in the aptitude test. Thus, Triss's selection of being divergent and special starts to feel arbitrary. And what can be frustrating as a reader is that to eliminate Caleb, you just have to talk about genetics and how people can lose the genetic lottery in any of the books. But she didn't. The failure of Triss Pryor. Tobias. Tobias is thought to be a divergent up until the last novel, where it's revealed that he has a gene to resist the serums, but nothing else. He's a pseudo-divergent. The frustration comes that Tobias is following the narrative constants in their hidden state, but not their revealed state, which logically does not make sense because the rules are the same exact set of rules. The only difference is how much the reader knows about them. So it absolutely makes no sense that Tobias is not divergent and never was. It's sort of batted away with a casual, you have some genetic markers, but not all, and up until that point, there's nothing to explicitly indicate pseudo-divergence. There are no hidden rules that we can pick up on that Tobias is operating by. In simple terms, nothing is planted for us to willingly accept that Tobias just isn't divergent, even though he was acting like one up until that point. The answer is simply not good enough for us. With the explicit acknowledgement of there being a gradient of divergency, then how was Caleb not even a little divergent? Why wasn't he, like Tobias, given one faction as a result of his aptitude test, but able to resist serums? How can we accept that Caleb, who is Triss's brother, who has no divergency whatsoever, but Tobias does when he has one divergent parent who might not be 100% divergent like Triss and Caleb's mother? Selection process lacks narrative anima. We don't see the selection process fail or become refined, and we don't see it defined with any nuance with its complete abandonment of Caleb. It doesn't really feel like it's as alive as the world it resides in, but rather a flat and arbitrary decision maker that the characters must follow because the author said so. Tobias not being divergent doesn't really change anything about the story, except it helps him form an alliance with other genetically damaged people, which could have been done regardless of his status. He doesn't suddenly become unequipped to handle scenarios, and he doesn't really seem all that characteristically different from other divergents. Additionally, another lack of the narrative Anima is that we don't see a stark personality difference in Triss and other divergents compared to other people. At least, it's not really pointed out. In theory, Triss should be equally capable to be aggressive and kind, stupid and smart, fearful and dauntless, honest and deceitful, and then selfish and selfless. So the aptitude test is another place where it seems very clear to me that Veronica did not think everything through, because based on the way that it should be testing and evaluating people, Eric should be from Amity. Yeah, you know, the psychopath from the first book? He should have pinged Amity.
You're gonna stand there while he throws those knives. And if I see you flinch, you're out.
The aptitude test must be detecting a single pure trait, because Triss has pinged 3 traits which make her divergent, and divergent is to be genetically pure. If it detected damaged traits, then Triss would be more genetically damaged than everyone else based on the results pinging thrice. Based on what little we get about the Purity Wars, we know that the damaged traits caused 3 problems in the world. Lack of compassion, when you take away being dumb, scared, or dishonest, so you become erudite, dauntless, or candor. A lack of motivation and assertiveness when you take away aggression, so you'd be an Amity. And then lack of self-preservation, when you take away selfishness, you'd be an abnegation. So, because Tobias got abnegation, we assume that he is genetically pure in abnegation traits, making him both capable of being selfish and selfless. But in turn, he should be intelligent, dauntless, honest, and nice, but incapable of compassion, and he should lack motivation and assertiveness. Triss has traits in abnegation, erudite, and dauntless, so does that mean she's genetically damaged in amity and candor? Does that mean she's somewhat incapable of compassion in the context of honesty, like all lying is bad no matter what? And is she incapable of having motivation and asserting herself? That seems pretty accurate, based on what we know about her character. Again, we've come up against that Triss is divergent, but by the rules of the book, she is maybe a little over 50% in terms of her divergency? Maybe? The rules of the aptitude test and what exactly it's looking for and how it manages to sort people into factions and detect divergence is unclear. Eric is dauntless, but by this train of logic we're following, we'd assume that he originally pinged amity because he has no compassion and clearly the capacity to show aggression, which would only be a trait the amity have the capacity for. Additionally, the damaged amity trait breeds a lack of motivation and assertiveness, which Eric doesn't lack at all. But he was born in erudite and is known for his intelligence and is described as an erudite in dauntless clothing. So with that, we're led to believe that he probably pinged erudite. So what we're seeing is that the rules of the book, all those narrative constants, tell us Eric should have been sorted into amity. He has both the capacity to be kind and cruel. And I know what you're thinking. That makes absolutely no sense. If you have the damaged trait for amity, shouldn't that mean we would get the results for amity? If you can't be cruel, shouldn't that mean you should go to the group that's characterized by its kindness? Well, remember that everyone gets to ultimately choose which faction they go into. The test is detecting the pure trait, so the capacity to be both kind and cruel. That means for the people who aren't very kind, amity might not feel a great fit for them, so you look elsewhere. Tobias, as a character, actually supports this because he pinged abnegation, which makes him capable of both being selfish and selfless. And if he didn't see himself as particularly selfless, then choosing abnegation would be a mistake. Also, having the pure abnegation gene means she's capable of both, which explains her lack of self-preservation. Her seeming inability to be cruel supports that she has a damaged amity gene. If all of this kind of sounds interesting to you, I am afraid to tell you that none of this is in the book. It's not even touched on. The fact that by the book's own logic, Eric pinged amity is fascinating and tells the audience a whole lot more about the aptitude test and what it's looking for. But none of this is in the novel. It's heavily implied that Eric was originally slated to go to erudite, and he chose dauntless. This also implies that genetically pure doesn't actually mean being damage-free. It just means having enough purified traits to be a complex human who can coexist in society with other genetically pure humans. Tobias is said to have a gene that makes him serum resistant, but that's not really associated with any of the 5 faction, which implies that there are more damage traits than the aptitude can even detect. So all of this nuance that I've talked about seems to redeem Divergent just a little bit. It's probably all wrong, because we're not necessarily told that there are exactly 5 genes they messed with, at least not what I recall. And Tobias's serum-resistant gene implies that there's actually 6 if the factions each equate to 1 damaged gene. And if the damaged genes do not directly link to one of the 5 factions, then we still haven't answered the question. What does the aptitude test exactly test for, and why does whatever it's testing for ping Triss as Divergent? We should be able to see a considerable difference between Triss and non-divergents. Their more damaged genes would have an uptick in lack of compassion, lack of motivation and assertiveness, and lack of self-preservation in comparison to Triss. It should be really obvious that everyone seems to have the same personality in all of these respects, with like one notable difference. Eric's aggression should confuse Triss because so few Dauntless seem to be that aggressive. Tobias's middle ground of selflessness and selfishness should puzzle Triss because she's only seen that within the walls of abnegation, not outside of it. Triss should have noticed that Caleb can sometimes be really stupid, and isn't that strange for him to end up in erudite? Triss is in a spot where she has privileged information. She knows that she is divergent. It's reasonable for her to be a little more aware than the average person on why everyone has the same personality except for in 1 or 2 aspects. This concept is supported by the fact that erudite are the ones killing divergents. They too may have noticed this pattern, and that it coincides with the resistance to the serums. But Triss doesn't really seem to care or notice one of the most important things about the novel, the personalities of her peers, and why they're so bizarre compared to her own. So, Divergent fails to answer the tropic question. It fails to be clear in the qualifications of the selection process, and the changes of selection don't coincide with any narrative constants. It does eliminate all other possible candidates, but neglects any level of nuance to the selection process, thereby depriving it of any narrative anima. It seems arbitrary. Triss is the chosen one, the Divergent, because Veronica Roth says so. And even though the book technically does eliminate Caleb and Tobias, it doesn't seem to do it in a way that makes sense with all of the narrative constants. So we can amend the third observation. Elimination of all other possible candidates for every round of selection the protagonist undergoes, either literal or thematic, in a way that it does not contradict any narrative constants. 1 is doomed to fail because it needs a narratively sound selection process and a reasonable elimination of all other candidates, both which Triss does not have. Let's circle back to something that we saw with both Katniss and Jonas, in the idea that they were selected twice, one for their actual chosen one selection process and a second one specifically for the plot. Triss is technically selected a second time, and the second time it fails because we don't exactly know what Triss is attempting to do. I must admit, I don't have the books anymore, and so I'm reading synopsises on the internet, and Triss doesn't really seem to have a clear goal. She's just aimlessly running from place to place while the world falls apart around her. I legitimately can't remember why the second book is called Insurgent and the third is called Allegiant. And I'm a title snob. I'm very judgy about titles. This is just another interesting trend. In the 3 novels we have seen, there are 2 rounds of selection for the chosen one, and therefore 2 rounds of elimination. Why is Jonas chosen to be the receiver? Why must it be Jonas who escapes with Gabriel? Why is Katniss chosen in the reaping? Why must it be Katniss that leads the rebellion? Why is Triss considered divergent? Veronica. So, I would like to propose that novels which are successful with the chosen one trope have made them valuable for a secondary objective. It's one thing to be chosen, but what does that actually mean? What does it make you capable of doing in practice? Why is it relevant to the plot? This is selection. leads him to give his community back the human experience. Katniss' selection leads her to becoming the face of the rebellion. Triss's selection in Divergent makes her a target for the erudite, but it doesn't really give us any other reason why Triss being special actually matters. All Divergent seems to do for her is make everyone want to kill her, and we don't even know why because there doesn't seem to be much difference between Triss and everyone else beyond what we've been told to accept as true. There's no evidence to support that being Divergent really matters. Tobias makes being Divergent almost irrelevant, actually. You could have told the story from Caleb's perspective and it wouldn't really change much. It might have actually been better because he's closer to the villain. So we are adding a fifth and final observation to our list. Chosen ones are chosen twice. Once for whatever the selection process demands, and two, for why that's important to the plot. So what if you're special? What are you gonna do about it? We have clear answers for Jonas and Katniss. We don't really have a clear answer for Triss. So this is how we get away with the chosen one. This is how we get this junkyard writing to turn on and run. So you remember that thing I said we were going to circle back to? We're going to circle back to that now. I mentioned before that Divergent could have been told from Caleb's perspective and we wouldn't really have lost much. Veronica Roth doesn't make a very strong case for why it must be Triss and not anyone else. Every storyteller should be able to defend why their protagonists are the protagonists and why not anyone else. We know that it isn't particularly hard to do because every novel isn't labeled as having a chosen one, despite the fact that almost every novel inherently includes at least one. And there are other stories that use a selection process. Romance novels require a love interest to be selected, thrillers need victims and perpetrators, mysteries need someone to solve it, and adventurers need adventurers to go outside and explore. National treasure has Ben Gates because Ben descends from a long line of so-called conspiracy theorists who've carried this one legend over several generations. Done. Dead Space has Isaac Clarke because he's the engineer and therefore knows how to handle deadly equipment and work in unpleasant conditions and would rather live than die. Done. Me Before You has William Traynor and Louisa Clark because William is rich and needs a caretaker and Louisa is desperate for money. Done. None of these are chosen one narratives, so we don't need to go in depth the way that you would need with characters like Jonas, Katniss, and Triss. But even so, we need to know why they're the main character of the story, and why not somebody else. You're probably not going to be able to answer this question in your first draft, and maybe not even your second. Don't be overwhelmed by not being able to complete all 5 parts, all 5 observances in the first draft. All that matters is that you have the answers before publish. No one is going to notice you didn't have all the answers at the beginning, but everyone will notice if the answer isn't there at all.